Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Casey Santangelo. I'm the head of Fine Art and Specie for AXA XL here in the Americas. And I am just so excited to be here discussing a topic a little bit more exciting than insurance today. So we're thrilled to have Tom Hill and Astrid Hill Lloyd here with us discussing their family approach to multi-generational collecting. The Hill family really brings such a unique perspective to collecting, blending both tradition with their personal passion across generations. So thank you both for being here with us today. We're really excited for this conversation. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Tom and his wife, Janine, have started this collection about 3 decades ago and have built such a remarkable collection spanning from old masters to contemporary art. If you aren't familiar with the collection, which I'm sure you are, we've got a glimpse of their collection, some highlights scanning up here on the board to share with you some personal favorites of mine from Christopher Wool. So really excited to be here today, and so thrilled to have Astrid Hill Lloyd with us here today. Thank you, Astrid. Astrid serves as the Vice President for the Hill Art Foundation, which was founded in 2019 with the intent of sharing their collection with the public. So let's dive right in, and I think we'll start with you, Tom. Why don't we start from the beginning? How did your passion for art begin, and what led you to start collecting?
Well, before I do that, I want to thank AXA. My wife was on the board of AXA Art Insurance, and for many years was there as AXA went through all sorts of really interesting moments around how to insure art. And I have to say, AXA has done an amazing job insuring our art. So a plug for AXA. So, and no losses, right?
That's right.
We take care of the art. So where did it start? I think it started growing up in New York City, being next to all these amazing museums. My mother was an artist. My sister was an artist and taught art. And I was lucky that my mother would take me to these wonderful places. I mean, I had to wait to get into the Frick. I think the age limit was, 14 or something like that. And so, when I turned 14, or whatever it is, they should get that changed down to 10 at least.
Yeah.
I went, with my mom, but, we had an apartment on Fifth Avenue right next to the Metropolitan Museum. And so it was a unique opportunity to be exposed. And so that's how it started. And at Harvard College, I was fortunate enough to be able to take all the art courses. I was doing work at the Carpenter Center, making movies, and had an opportunity to just experiment. And I had no idea that I was going to actually pursue art. But then, things came along. I had to get a job. I had no money. And it was only, I would say, after I was co-CEO of Lehman Brothers. After I left Lehman Brothers, I said, I think, that was long before it went bankrupt, I might add. I said, I think, this is really something I'd like to pursue. Mm-hmm. And that was when, we said, okay, where do we start? And we said, well, we're going to start by actually making a list of the 8 artists, and these are all contemporary artists, living artists, that if we ever had any money, because at that point I was still trying to, accumulate some capital, we would want to buy. And on that list was Warhol, Lichtenstein, Bacon, Twombly, de Kooning. And there were 8 artists, Rouchet. And I put that list away. And then one day I said, okay, I think I can start. And our first purchase was a Warhol soup can. And everyone knows Andy died in '87. I had known him because he hung out at Harvard in the late '70s, in the late 60s. And for some reason, he thought Harvard people were interesting. And he thought maybe, because, he always recorded, he always had a recording device. I mean, he invented, selfies with his passport photographs. He actually invented streaming. So he always had his tape recorder and his Polaroid. And, I had an opportunity to spend time with him. And, I said, Andy, why are you here? Oh, I might learn something. And I said, well, what are you going to learn? Oh, these protests against the Vietnam War. And so, basically, that gave me a window into how he thought about art. And that was, I think, a good precedent for if the artist is somebody who we actually are committed to, we want to spend time with the artist and actually understand how they think.
And is that Warhol still in your collection?
Totally.
What a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that. So Astrid, we'll pivot a bit to you, I think. How did you first become involved in the family collection?
Well, I feel very lucky that I grew up with a lot of these modern masters that my dad was just talking about in my home. And something I remember is every Saturday, my dad would meet with Larry Gagosian, and I would sit outside the meeting, and Andy would give me catalog after catalog of different artists and shows, and I would just study them and read all about these artists. And that really started my budding interest in art history. And then I went on to study more at Brown, and also to do Christie's education, the Modern Masters program. So that was really where I started.
And do you happen to recall the first purchase that your father made that really intrigued you?
I would have to say that would be a Ron Mueck self-portrait. That's 6 feet tall. It's like a mask, and it's so detailed down to the pores, the hair follicles. And I remember coming home with my mom one afternoon, and this piece was hanging in the living room. And my mother I was intrigued by it because I'd never seen something so out of proportion in my entire life, which is what Ron Mueck really plays with. My mom was slightly more appalled. It's an amazing piece, but I have to say that it was just shown recently a few years ago at the Hill Art Foundation. But it's still not hanging in our living room.
Well, and one side note, I had seen that self-portrait of Ron in the Sensation show, where, as you know, it was extraordinary. The works of art, many of them were Specie, and our mayor at the time, Giuliani, tried to shut that show down because there was a Chrysophilia painting that had Christ and had some dung. And it was viewed as, oh, well, this is not appropriate. And when I saw that work of art, and as you know, Saatchi, a great collector, but he changed his mind often. And so at one point I got the call because I told Dauphin, who was his dealer, if that ever comes up, and he was, I want it. And that's sometimes what you got to do, which is put out, if you like to fish, you got to put out lines, and sometimes you get a bite.
That's right.
And so, Saatchi, through Dauphin, called up and said, it's available. I said, I'll buy it.
That's fantastic.
My wife usually gets veto power on everything. There's some things I consult her on. It was a fait accompli. And in order to carry this thing, which weighed, about 100 pounds, even though it's fiberglass, it's 6 feet, it's just a face. We had 3 unbelievably gifted art handlers, and 2 of them had cuts because his beard is sharp, and so and they were trying to get this up. Anyway, so art, sometimes you got to be careful, and
that's
where you put it and how you hang it.
I love to hear you say that, being on the insurance side. Art in motion is art in transit, so we worry a lot about things going wrong during transit. So, okay, well, it sounds like from what you're saying, Astrid's interest in the collecting was quite obvious from a very early age. How have you incorporated her interests into the collecting?
Well, it's really simple. I don't have the time to actually be out there, a Geiger counter looking for uranium. Astrid, that's her business. And so for younger, particularly women artists, Astrid is like unbelievably gifted at finding these artists, whether it's Sarah Crowner, even before Sarah appeared in the Whitney Biennial. Astrid had figured her out. Last night at the Chen Adams opening, who was there? The person that first introduced us to Mika Tajima, your buddy. Augusto. So, Astrid is there as the Geiger counter, trying to find those artists that, not only we like, but we want to collect in depth.
That's right. Very great. And Astrid, how would you say your perspective differs from your father? Do you have similar taste or distinct differences in the way that you look at art and collect?
Well, I would just as my father was saying, I'm much more focused on the young, very contemporary artists and really talking to people, talking to lots of gallerists, seeing MFA programs, and going to pop-ups. And so that's what I'm really interested in. So
sounds like you guys are really engaged with each other and in tune with collecting. But it's kind of a fun question. Do you consult one another when you're making a new acquisition?
Absolutely. I would say that, I usually don't consult Astrid when I'm about to buy an old master painting because, I'm afraid, I might get some, unbelievably insightful comment where I'd have to say, oh, maybe I have to reconsider this. So I tend to rely on, experts from museums when I'm buying an old master painting. But other than that, I want Astrid's point of view.
And we sometimes play this game where when artists are having a show and we look at the preview together and we'll try and figure out which one we think is the best. And if we land on the same one, great. But if we don't, it's actually very interesting because we'll talk about why we think one or the other piece is better. And that really lends itself to learning more about the artist.
That's great. So Tom, you've been collecting for over 3 decades now, and obviously the market has changed quite significantly during that time. How have you, incorporating those changes, how has that changed your acquisition strategy, and how do you look at the market?
Well, what we've always tried to do is have art that speaks to each other. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget, Jean Thaw, who was not only a great collector, but a great dealer, wrote the book that is, if you're interested in collecting, the history of collecting, and whether it's the Morozov or Shukin collections, about how they accumulated all these amazing Cézannes. They were Russians, and it was all expropriated after the Russian Revolution. But the idea is to really understand the art ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I have found most important is the various personalities that you can actually learn from in the art world. And you can learn from artists. I mean, I learned a lot, from Warhol and reading what he wrote. I learned a lot from Cy Twombly, but also what we've always wanted to do is make the connections. And Twombly lived in Rome. He knew the Renaissance. And, we decided early on that it was not inconsistent. I mean, I think the same week, we bought a Renaissance bronze and we bought a Warhol soup can. And it was, well, what are you doing? They said, well, I don't think those two are inconsistent, but you got to actually have a plan where the totality is greater than the sum of the parts, and it all comes together in a dialogue. And that's what we try to do in our foundation, which is have a dialogue. So when Sarah Crowner had her show, what we did was say, okay, Sarah, you get to choose any sculptures. And she had gotten, a study grant, from the American Academy in Rome. She got to know not only Twombly, but his work. And she said, well, I'd like to actually have my paintings and my sculpture juxtaposed with Twombly sculpture. And I said, I can make that happen. So we'll, put our Twombly sculpture in and we'll borrow others. So Aggie Gund was kind enough to lend one. We borrowed another from Larry Gagosian, and, borrowed another from another major collector. So, these connections, and that's when we actually do a show at our art foundation or in our home. We juxtapose the 4 disciplines, which is old master paintings, Renaissance and Baroque bronzes, modern masters, and then really contemporary artists.
And just another example, the show that we have up right now, Sam Moyer, which everyone should go see if you haven't, is her work is juxtaposed with many different artists. For example, Noguchi, and it's just an amazing connection.
Bob Gober.
Bob Gober.
Jasper Johns. So
it's great. And your exhibition space showcasing your works and Works on Loan opened in 2019. How do you engage the next generation, and how do you think about your vision for the future?
Well, I don't know what the next generation is, because it took me until I was well in my 40s to actually begin to have the time, because you got to read a lot, you got to look a lot, and you got to talk to people a lot. And the question is, where do you look? What are you interested in? And then with whom do you have conversations? And I found, again, going back to the ecosystem, that if you could actually establish a network, and it all depended on what area you were collecting in, because Renaissance and Baroque bronze is very different than old master paintings, very different than modern masters or even contemporary art. So I actually developed relationships, not just with curators at museums, but with scholars who would write. They weren't necessarily in museums. With dealers. A great source of information around. Eugene Thaw, great collector, but an amazing dealer. Richard Feigen, amazing, and Isabel is here. Amazing collector, and he taught me more about gold grounds. And sometimes he would say, "Okay, I'm ready," because he had this extraordinary collection of gold grounds, that he would say, "I'm ready to part with that," because I never forget, Isabel, the dinners in your dining room where you would see Fra Angelico's, you'd see the most extraordinary gold ground paintings. And so I think over time you have to, just like we did with the original 8, have a wish list. And the wish list can be categories, but it can also be individual works of art. In the case of modern and contemporary, it's much easier. So with Warhol, because he did series, you could say, I want, over time, an electric chair. And I couldn't have my Warhol electric chair until my wife let me, and which meant that Astrid went to school, because she said, I don't want an electric chair, as beautiful as they are, in our home until Astrid's off at college. So took me a while to get that electric. Now I've got the most beautiful red electric chair, but I knew which one, it was a collective. I'd seen it at the Museum of Modern Art retrospective of Andy's after he had died, and that was the one. So sometimes you can develop your wish list and just be patient.
Patience. Your family has a very robust lending program, which is a little bit different when we think about other collectors in this space. What do you hope to achieve through that lending program? You've been at AIC, the Frick, other global institutions. Do you have a specific goal when you're lending out to other institutions?
First goal, and again, going back to AXA, I want to make sure the art is protected.
Thank you.
And so you do not want to lend any significant work of art where there's a risk, either a geopolitical risk, a risk of damage, a risk they don't have, if it's an old master painting on panel, they don't have the right humidity. So you have to measure risks in everything you do. But if you're lending, if there's a Francis Bacon show, and you're lending to Tate, to the Prado and to the Metropolitan Museum, where I was on the board, at least the risk factors can be dealt with. But second thing is you want to make sure that your work is in good company. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to lend to a show where, maybe, you've got a great one. It's a little bit like what Ronald Lauder says, which is, there's, an O, oh my God, and oh, wow. And, you want good company with your works of art. So I think there are a whole bunch of factors and criteria that you use, and you want to make sure there's a good catalog, and you want to know who's writing, the essays in the catalog. So it becomes a process, and everyone knows I'm open to a loan, and so the question is, is it the right venue for a work of art? And we rarely, if it's an established museum, say no.
Right. You're very in tune with the market. Do you personally make all of the decisions on the lending, or do you involve a team in that?
No, I make the decisions.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, no doubt about it. I think I'm in the best position to assess the risk.
Okay, we'll pivot a little bit to you, Astrid. How do you think that your preferences in collecting might alter the future of the family collection?
Well, I'm more focused on the young and contemporary side of it. So I think because of that, the collection may skew a little bit more towards that side of it. And what I find really important in sort of defining if a work is a great work of art is first seeing it in person. I think that's incredibly important. Second, trying to do a studio visit or meet the artist, learn more about the artist, learn about the history of art having to do with the artist and who they're influenced by, and then also which institutions and museums and collectors are buying that work of art.
I think Astrid has a much harder job than I do. I mean, if I, in the old master area, I say, I want, a Rubens portrait. It's pretty well established where you go hunting for that. Mm-hmm. And Rubens, is not going to lose his standing in the art world, or others that we've collected. But with Astrid, you actually have to do a lot more thinking about where an artist and a given body of work is in the history of art. Because there is, as Alfred Barr said, whenever I buy work of art, and this was in, the 50s and 60s when it was much easier, there was less competition. He said, I only have about a 3 or 4% hit ratio, which is for every Twombly, for every Warhol, I will have out of 100, I'll have 97 misses in terms of the art is notwithstanding the test of time. So she's got a much harder job. So I let her do the work, and I go on her coattails.
And Astrid, how do you plan to engage the next generation?
Well, I work at the foundation, but I also have an art advisory, Monticule Art Advisory. And so I'm already engaging the next generation because I work with a lot of them as clients. And I think the next generation is more interested in these younger contemporary artists because they can relate to them more, do studio visits, rather than the blue chip modern masters. So.
And you engage a lot of students in your foundation, right?
Yes, we have a high school student program called the Teen Curators, and they meet every week, and they meet for an entire semester, and then at the end they have these wonderful presentations where they work on either a specific piece in the current collection, and their families come, and it's a really wonderful program.
That's a really good point, Astrid, which is, where do you get your information? And when we hear these presentations, learn a lot from our teen curators about their observations, just like we learn a lot from the artists who are saying, here's what I was thinking about. And Kevin Beasley, who was at the dinner last night for Ixchan Adams, was talking specifically, he's got a new exhibition out at Storm King that's unbelievable. If you have a chance, go see it, of outdoor sculpture. And, you learn a lot, from the artists, but you also learn a lot from those people who know the history of art. Mm-hmm. And, whether it's curators, whether it's writers. I mean, David Saleh, the artist, we got him to do an exhibition. He's got a studio out in East Hampton, and we're friends. And I said, David, the book that you've written, which is How to See, is one of the most important books. And he's a great art critic, writes beautifully for the New York Review of Books, and I read everything he writes. Just like Gene Thaw, was a beautiful writer on the history. Did the Jackson Pollock catalog resume, but you can learn so much. And I said, David, if you were to do a show, what would you want in the show? And he said, I'd like to have one of my 80s works paired with a Francis Bacon painting. And I said, I think I can do that. Which of the 4 Bacons we own do you want? And so he said, I want, I showed him pictures of the 4. He said, I want that one. So that was the genesis of the show.
Lovely. Tom, can you talk to us a little bit about what role you think collecting plays in preserving the family heritage and stories across generations?
Oh my goodness, I think that's really something that I can't forecast, because some major collectors, again, Gene Thaw, a lot of his ended up works at the Morgan Library. A lot of, you go to the Frick, some of, one of the best Gold Ground paintings is one of Gene's. So, but when you saw the works of art that he collected in his home, again, the totality was greater than the individual works of art. Mm-hmm. So what we are trying to do is create something, for me, for our family, that I don't think survives, because a lot of the works of art will either be given to museums mm-hmm. or sold, just because of the values. And in this country, estate taxes are draconian, and so I can't forecast. But what I can do is say, I think a number of artists have been able to use our collection to actually spur additional ideas. When we did the Charlie Ray show, he specifically wanted to juxtapose his works with our Renaissance and Baroque. And in fact, if you saw the show that Charlie did, it was at the Pompidou. We had a show at the Met. It was the Pompidou, and also Burst de Commerce, which is Pinot's foundation. And there was a Susini crucifixion that had been in the show he did at our foundation, and he blew it up to a 16-foot paper mache crucifixion patterned after our, Susini crucifixion. Mm. So watching the artists put the pieces together, mm-hmm. and that's something that we can do, Astrid and I and Sarah, Needham, who is president of our foundation, what we can do, to actually create a current dialogue. But I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah,
you're leaving your mark on the art world.
So
that's for sure. Okay. And what role does the legacy, well, this question, I guess, is really for both of you. What role does the legacy and the future of your collection play in your acquisition strategy?
Well, there are two principles, and again, I go back to Gene Thaw, and they're negative, which is, never get into the accumulation business, which is just buying things. And second, never buy a work of art because you think the price is going to go up.
That's right.
As an investment. The investment word is, now, you can be really lucky and sure. have a work of art. David Rockefeller, when he sold his Rothko painting, he had bought that for, I think, $10,000, and sells it for $85 million. Okay, not bad. But he had no idea.
Not bad.
He had no idea. And so you can't, and you get into real trouble, because it's a little bit like the stock market. You end up chasing things, and all these factors come in, like momentum and sentiment, and you're going to end up really not happy with your purchases, and not happy with the result.
Yeah, your passion, both of you, for the art is very clear. So. Okay, I think this is the last question we have here. So I think as we close out the discussion, I wondered if both of you could share the most valuable lessons that you've learned along your career and in your journey as collectors, and what you think might be helpful for emerging collectors.
Astrid, you start, because you have an incredible eye, and how you've juxtaposed. I mean, talk about Lauren Quinn, where an artist I'd never even heard of. Astrid goes out to LA, meets this incredible woman artist, and you bought the first work, and then our friend Arnie Glimpsher does this major show down in his new studio, down in his new exhibition space of all these amazing Lauren Quinns. And so, because Astrid got there first, I had an opportunity to buy the one I wanted from the show.
So remind me what the question is.
Maybe valuable lessons that you've learned along the way that would be helpful for sort of more emerging collectors as they embark on their journey.
Okay, I think it's very important to see the works in person. If you can, I think it's very important to understand the process behind the work and how it's made. And also to speak to the artist, do a studio visit if you can, and really learn about how this artist, which artists are influence this artist in the history of art. And what's my last thing?
You're on a roll.
No, I think that's it.
And also staying power, right?
Yeah, staying power.
So not only in the history of art, but is this an artist that has a chance of being relevant 50, 100 years from now? A chance, because it's really hard to forecast. And so for me, it's all about having a framework, which is where does any given work of art fit in the history of art? What kind of dialogue can I have with the particular work of art I'm thinking about buying, in juxtaposition with everything else? A quality judgment, which is, again, going back to Ronald Lauder, is it the best example of a given artist? And that's particularly, we just bought a Bassano it was in an English collection for 300 years, and during the pandemic, they need, as you know, the Brits, often have these estates and have leaking roofs, and so they needed, to actually fix the roof. And so, and I knew this was an earlier picture than the one in the National Gallery in London. It was earlier, and so, and I'd known about this particular picture, and I had a chance to buy it. So, where does a given work of art, fit? And then how is it going to fit in our collection? Right. So what's going to be the dialogue between that Bassano and a Twombly chalkboard, or other works of art that we want? And then why? You have to ask yourself, why am I going to buy this? And often say, oh my goodness, I don't have a good enough rationale for why I'm buying it. And obviously the money factors in. Sure. Can I afford it? But why am I buying this? Mm-hmm. And what's the purpose, and where does it fit? And I never buy a work of art because I think at some point I'm going to sell it. Now, I have sold things.
Sure.
We had our rule of 4, which is for major artists, particularly modern, contemporary. I wanted to have at least 4 major works of them. We bought this amazing Rothko. I couldn't, swing by another 3 great Rothkos. And Rothko is a hard one because you almost need, like the chapel, down in Houston, you almost need a separate room. Mm-hmm. And, I sold it, set a record price, and bought another Bacon. So you have to, and from my standpoint, you never look back. And I've done some really stupid things. I bought a Basquiat, from Peter Brandt, who is this leading expert, major collector of Basquiats. I bought it, in the 90s, and sold it, for triple what I paid. And then, subsequently it was sold, and it's in, a major French collection, and they paid 10 times what the previous person. So, but you never look back.
Mm-hmm.
So
why don't we close with one last fun question? Do you each have a favorite artist or piece of work in the collection currently?
You start.
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here. This wasn't scripted, so.
I think I really love the Vic Muniz, as I said before. And I really do appreciate and love some of the old master paintings and some of the gold grounds, because I think they're just unbelievable in the way that they're painted and how they've influenced so many artists.
It's like, you don't have a favorite child, you don't have a favorite grandchild, and each day, I make it a rule that I look at every work of art that when I'm in one of our homes, and the good news is we have enough homes so that I can go and look at different places, but each work of art has to excite me, on that moment, and it could be in the morning, at night, and so I don't have any favorites, but it is, you have to constantly look and say, does this work? Mm-hmm. Does the juxtaposition work? Mm-hmm. And does it work in terms of my sensibility? So.
Well, thank you both for your time today. This has been such a great conversation.
Thank you all. I tell you, on a rainy day, I thank you for being here, because it's pretty dreadful outside. So,
yeah, that's right.
You had to
lovely turnout for a yucky day in New York. I think we've got some time built in for Q&A, so Simone's going to walk around with the microphone if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask of Tom or Astrid.
This is for both of you. You referenced Barr speaking about having a 3% success rate with buying contemporary art. And you buy a lot of contemporary art. You spoke about a few that you sold, such as the Basquiat or Rothko, where you made a lot of money. But there must be a lot of things in your collection that, well, maybe not, but I was going to say that you tire of, or that you want to move on from. And I'm wondering, do you deaccession minor things, or do you have a warehouse someplace? What happens to all that stuff you find in artists' studios?
I think, systematic pruning is a really good idea. And, so for instance, I am in the process right now of going through our Renaissance and Baroque bronzes. And I've got, the superstars in one category. Then I've got those works that are really good, but are not in the superstar category. And then I've got the others, and the odds are pretty high that, for the third category, I'm gonna, and, I'm at a point now where I've got to be thinking about, I don't want to burden Astrid or my other daughter with having to deal with these works of art. Better for me to deal with them while I'm alive, and I don't want it to be a burden for her. And so the answer is yes, systematic pruning is a really good idea. And we do have significant storage where, I can't, for contemporary, I will have a lot of art that I just have in storage, and I'll try it out periodically and, try it in different places. And we're building, 2 houses in Florida. So, I'm going to bring out certain art and just try it. And if I don't like it, it'll either go back into the storage area, or we'll sell it.
Hello,
So, yes,
I have a question.
Deaccession.
Hello. You have hinted at it in your conversation with your loan program and your impact with museums and whatnot, but just knowing that you're both such renowned philanthropists, how does philanthropy inform your collecting?
Well, I've never met a museum where I've either been on the board of or chairman of that hasn't wanted the works of art that we have. So it's really pretty simple, which is, and so we collect Jordan Castile, and the Metropolitan Museum didn't have a Jordan Castile. I'm chairman of the Guggenheim. They didn't have a Jordan Castile. So now they have Jordan Castiles. And we've got others, and other museums, constantly know that, works of art that we have, we may not die with them, or we may die with them, but then there'll be a promised gift. So it's all part of a master plan. But I think that's answering the question of legacy, which is, while we're alive, we can keep this together. So for instance, it's going to be up to Astrid as to whether she wants to keep the foundation going when I'm no longer around. It's going to be her call.
Yeah.
Other questions? Sarah, you get to ask the question that Sarah and I work together, so.
Why is education at the Hill Art Foundation important to you, and what are some examples of things you've learned from the teams?
Well, Astrid is very involved in the education side as well, but I just know who were my mentors. And in the art world, whether it was Jim Dimitrian at the Hirshhorn, who took me under his wing, or Richard Feigen, who saw me as somebody who was willing to learn. People forget that Richard showed the Bacon Popes in Chicago when you couldn't sell a Bacon Pope. This was in the 1950s. And Richard had this unbelievable taste. So what I think is really unbelievable is how you can learn. I mentioned you learn from dealers, from people in the art world, but education is critical because we're constantly learning. Astrid and I are constantly saying, well, that was a really good insight, and we take notes, and the students have a chance, and we always get the artists and the curators to come in and speak, and we're there when they're asking questions. And some of the questions, I said, boy, I wish I'd thought of that. They're really good. So that's part of the learning process. And the other thing too is, I was so lucky that people took me under their wings. And at Harvard, I had one professor who was particularly impactful. And, he spent a lot of time with me. And so I think that makes a big difference. So that's why we want to support education. You had a second piece to the question.
No, that was great. Well, Astrid, we talked a lot about your father's collection, your own collection. How do you kind of build that versus how your dad's done it?
How
are you building your collection versus your dad's?
I'm building my collection. Well, I always talk to my dad about what he thinks about a piece. But I'm building my collection by really getting to know the artists and going to their studios and hanging out with their friends and really becoming a part of sort of their network. And then they'll show me like a really interesting different piece that they might not show someone else because we're friends. And I'm also looking very closely at what small galleries are buying, and there's a few that are really strong, and I look to them, such as Rachel Uffner, to what they are collecting, and that's how I build my collection.
So this question. Go ahead. I'll ask this question to Astrid. I'm sort of curious too, as to your collecting, how important is it to you to have a broad range of multiple geographic backgrounds? So in terms of your international collecting, and how do you go about finding those cultural hubs, there's obviously enough here in New York, you can find your way, but I'm really curious how you really dig into other parts of the world on your collection.
Well, I'd like to expand my collection to include other parts of the world. I sort of focus on right now on Europe and New York, but there's certain mentors in my life, like Augusto Arbiso, who's constantly traveling, and he goes all around the world to Asia, Africa. And so I really look to him for advice on which artists are really good and up and coming, and he shows me a lot of material. So that's how I do that sort of thing. But in the future, I'd like to travel a lot more and really see these works for myself in person.
I think, the Jason Farago article on, Tate and Tate Modern and the international component there and how they went about putting a collection together. And we've done the same thing at the Guggenheim, where, we're building a very large museum in the Emirates. And we've been buying art from all around the world. So not just from the Middle East, but Latin America, Africa, North, South, Mid Africa, and Asia Pacific. And so how do you go about doing it is really interesting. And I have to say, Richard Armstrong and now Marriott Westermann put together, I would say, a group of scholars and a group of curators and really knowledgeable people in each of the regions, and divided the world up, not dissimilar to what Tate Modern did in terms of really systematic about, if we want art, that's a truly global, representation, you have to get into, essentially local customs, the culture, and experts on the ground, and because it's really a local game, and then you over time. So again, this artist Igshan Adams, who's from South Africa, it was interesting because when Cecilia Alemani did the Venice Biennale, one of the most beautiful works was an Igshan Adam. It was about 35 feet wide, and that work of art, from a South African artist, is going to be at Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. We bought it, we saw it, and the team there said this is great, and so it's going to be one of the mainstays. So I think you got to get into really a deep dive in the local art market, and it's the ecosystem, and who do you know, what access do you have, and are you able to execute? And I think Astrid, you have 2 children, and so you're not spending that time, but Augusto is, and her friend, and so she is using Augusto as her eyes and ears for different parts of the world where she can't get to.
I have a 7-day-old child.
So you had a question.
Yes. So you both have mentioned that how an artist relates to art history or their work within the canon is very important to your collecting. I was wondering if there is a movement within art history or a group of artists within art history that you find really drives your collecting or your preferences.
Oh my goodness, that's a really good question. I would say in the old master painting area, Mannerist painting was really important. So we bought this extraordinary Pontormo that was in the Medici show, and that tradition. But then leading up to Rubens and Caravaggio, and use of light, and as you know, Rubens in 1604, 1605 was in Italy. Saw Caravaggio's work in Rome and in Naples, and so I'd say in old masters that was a key element, and in modern masters it is equally divided between abstraction, whether it's Twombly, or figuration. Like Warhol. I mean, Warhol was a portrait painter, and those are the I'd say, and in Renaissance, and Baroque bronzes, it's mostly an Italian focus for us. I mean, we have some Dutch, so we have Tetroda, but to Marietta, but mostly Italian.
Well, thank you both so much for being here
Well,
today.
thank you
It's
for
been such a
being
lovely
here.
conversation.
Thank you.